This story begins near a train tunnel. Next to the tunnel was a forest where workers felled many trees, and one of those workers was Robert. Robert was from Idaho, but he never knew who his real parents were. When he was only 6 years old, his father went out for cigarettes and never returned. Since then, the people who raised him wrote the words "from Idaho" on a piece of paper, put it on him, and placed him alone on a train. When he arrived at that strange place, strangers took him in. No one explained why he had been separated from his parents, nor even what was happening. To survive, Robert decided to work in a shop owned by a Chinese family, but sometimes officers would come and arrest the Chinese workers to deport them from America. Part of it was out of fear, and the other part was for survival. Later, Robert began living with an old man, but one day, that old man died unexpectedly, likely due to a wild animal. The truth isn't fully described. After that, Robert stopped going to school and began wandering from place to place in search of work. As time passed, without realizing it, Robert began to grow up. During this time, he started going to church, perhaps seeking peace, perhaps looking for a place to belong, since he had never belonged to anything. It was there that he met Gladys. The first time she saw him, she smiled and asked curiously, "Who are you? Where are you from?" Robert felt shy and answered in a low voice, but after that day he began to enjoy church, perhaps more for her than for anything else. Their small talks slowly turned into long conversations, and in just 3 months, they decided to marry. Perhaps they were Christians. After their wedding, they bought a small plot of land by the river. They planned to build a wooden house there. They even decided where the windows and doors would be. For the first time in his life, Robert finally felt he had a direction, a purpose, and someone to call family. But life was not easy. Robert had to travel far to find work shifts. Gladys was pregnant, so he had no choice. He had to earn money no matter what. During that time, he worked with people from many countries, from China and other places. Even though they were strangers, they behaved like a family. They worked together, shared food, laughed, and supported one another. Later, Robert and the other workers were given a very hard job, building a railway bridge. It was risky and exhausting work, but Robert had no choice. He had to do it because his family depended on it. One day, while they were working, a group of unknown men arrived and forcibly took a Chinese worker who was standing near Robert. Robert tried to stop them, shouting for help, but they pushed him from the unfinished bridge, and he died instantly. Several months later, the bridge was finished. Officials decided to test it with a locomotive, and the bridge held firm. People rejoiced because travel would now be faster, but Robert remained silent. He thought about how, in the future, thousands of people would cross that bridge, and no one would know the name of the man who died there. One day, another steel bridge would replace this one, and until then, the old bridge would be forgotten. From that day on, the memory of his Chinese friends remained forever in Robert's mind. Finally, after months, Robert returned home. Gladys hugged him tightly. He saw his newborn daughter for the first time, and tears filled his eyes. He gave Gladys the money he had earned, and even brought expensive whiskey from the city. That night, Gladys and Robert walked near the river. They talked, cooked dinner, and laughed together. Robert thanked God again, because for the first time, they had something he had always desired, a family. Life felt at peace, but his dreams were no longer calm. Every night, Robert dreamed of the same man, the one whose death no one would ever remember. Sometimes Robert and Gladys traveled to a nearby city to have a family photograph taken, just to remember the childhood of their daughter who would one day grow up. But soon the cycle of life continued, and a new logging season began. Robert worked every year with many new people. Most were homeless and had no family. He respected them deeply because they worked hard without complaining, and some barely spoke. There were workers who didn't say a single word for months. There was a quiet man named Hank, who Robert learned lived inside a tree instead of a proper house. And then there was Frank, who talked constantly about the Bible, as if he knew every word by heart. But one day, a stranger arrived and asked, "Where is Sam?" Frank heard the name, panicked, and fled, but the stranger pursued him and shot him. It was then that everyone learned the truth. Frank's real name was Sam. Years ago, he had killed the stranger's younger brother, which is why he had fled and taken refuge in the forest. The stranger apologized to the workers for the trouble and then left. Among them all, one of the most unforgettable men was Airy. No one knew where he came from, and he always chose the easiest jobs. But even his tasks were dangerous. He blasted tree roots with explosives and shouted loudly for everyone to cover their ears before doing so. Ari loved to brag. He often claimed he had worked more in his youth than the entire crew put together. He said he once worked 23 hours in a storm, and that even 60-degree heat Celsius didn't stop him. At night, he sang loudly and out of tune, and although everyone complained, Robert secretly liked the songs he played on his small mouth instrument. The work never stopped. When they finished one area, they moved to another. The forest disappeared tree by tree. Robert believed a true woodsman always knew which way a tree would fall, but one day, an error proved him wrong. A giant tree fell in the wrong direction, and 3 workers died instantly. At Ari's request, they nailed the dead workers' boots to the fallen tree, so their memory would stay in the forest forever. That moment remained etched in Robert's mind. A silent thought came to him. Maybe one day, that will be my fate too. When the season ended, Robert went home. His daughter had grown, and being home gave him peace. He played with her, listened to her little stories, and treasured every moment. But deep down, he knew he only saw fragments of her childhood, not the whole journey. This time, things were different. Gladys had learned to hunt and wanted to accompany him during the work seasons. She planned to cook, wash clothes, and help the crew so Robert could stay near his family. But Robert refused. He didn't want them living in the dangerous forest. Seeing her disappointment, he looked for work closer to home. The pay was low, but he accepted it. He helped a shopkeeper named Jack with odd jobs just to earn enough. Even when life was hard, the time with his daughter made it all worth it. One evening, Gladys shared a new idea. What if we buy land on installments? We could start a farm and maybe build a small grain mill. Then you would never have to leave us again. It was an expensive plan, but Robert loved the idea of finally building something for himself. He told himself, just one last season, one more time. After that, I'll start something of my own. The next morning, Robert picked up his axe again, looked silently at his wife and daughter, and headed to work. When he arrived at the site, he noticed things had changed. The contractors had become stricter and greedier. They shouted orders and reduced wages if the work wasn't finished fast enough. At night, the workers sat around a bonfire made of freshly cut logs and talked about the next season. Ari seemed unusually sad. He said they had cut down trees that were nearly 500 years old, and that if it weren't for the money, he would never do such work. Then he said a phrase that stayed with Robert forever. The trees have given us everything, but we cut them down and turned them into wagon wheels, and then we act like gods. It was harsh, but true. Before the night ended, Ari told Robert that he had worked with many people in his life, but if fate permitted, he would like to meet Robert again someday, because Robert was a good human being. Robert didn't know that would be Ari's last conversation. The next day, a small broken branch fell on Ari's head. The injury damaged his brain. Little by little, he began to forget faces, then names, then himself. After 8 painful days, Ari passed away. Someone whispered, Ari never believed the trees could take a life, but that's exactly what happened. However, Robert felt something different. Deep down, he believed that branch was meant for him. The season ended. Robert took a train home and fell asleep. When he woke up, people were looking out the window. The forest of his hometown was on fire. Robert's house was inside that forest. When the train stopped, there was total chaos. People running, screaming, trying to escape the fire. Robert searched for Gladys among the crowd, but found no trace of her. He ran toward the burning forest, but collapsed from the smoke and exhaustion. The next morning, when he woke up, he ran to check his house. Everything had been reduced to ashes. Even his daughter's toys were scattered and blackened. Robert stayed there for days, waiting for them to return, but no one came. Weak and heartbroken, he returned to the village, where the local shopkeeper gave him food and supplies. Robert returned to his empty plot and waited until he was nearly starving. One day, a wild bear passed by, but it didn't attack him, as if nature itself were showing him mercy. The loneliness became unbearable. Sometimes he spoke in his mind to his lost Chinese friend, asking why his family had been taken from him, but there was never an answer. The next morning, Jack appeared again with freshly hunted meat. Robert tried to say he would pay him back one day, but Jack refused and instead took him hunting to help distract him from his sadness. Seeing Jack hunt reminded Robert of Gladys. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "They aren't coming back." Jack sat beside him in silence. Over time, Robert built a small wooden cabin on the scorched earth. He survived on fish, mushrooms, and whatever nature offered. Still, he lived with a fear inside him. If they ever return, where will they stay? So he decided to rebuild the house from scratch. It seemed nature was watching his solitude, because one day, a stray dog and her puppies arrived and stayed with him. They became his silent companions. Robert worked slowly but steadily, cutting trees, shaping the wood, rebuilding his home. Sometimes he thought he heard his wife or daughter calling him, but when he turned around, there was only silence. Jack continued to visit him in the evenings. They shared simple meals, and every morning Jack would leave in silence, like a traveler passing through life. Months passed, and the new cabin was finished. At night, Robert would lie outside looking at the falling stars, remembering the past. Years went by. His family never returned, but he never stopped waiting. Loneliness finally pushed him back to work, but now everything was different. Trains ran over steel bridges. Workers used chainsaws instead of axes. Trees marked by workers of the past were felled without hesitation. Robert watched and thought, no one will remember the people who worked here, not even history. He was no longer strong. His body was slower, weaker. Age was finally catching up to him. One afternoon, an old worker approached him, Billy. Robert recognized him, but Billy didn't remember him until Robert gently reminded him. Billy asked about Ari, not knowing he had died long ago. Robert didn't tell him, because sometimes silence protects the heart. The two men sat in silence, realizing how much things had changed. New workers had replaced the old ones. People no longer shared meals. Everyone lived in separate groups. Billy nodded slowly, and in that moment, both men understood that the world had moved on without them. Time passed, and eventually, Robert stopped working as a logger. That is life. New workers replaced the old. On his way home from one of his last shifts, he washed in the river and felt a painful fear. What if one day I forget my daughter's face? His body was weakening, so he sought easier work. He rented a horse and carriage for $300 and began transporting supplies, and sometimes passengers for a small fee. It kept him busy, but in his mind, Gladys and his daughter were always there, laughing, calling, living. One morning, he gave a ride to a woman named Claire, the new forest ranger from Montana. She told him she had heard many stories about this place and shared something fascinating. 3,000 years ago, everything there was covered in ice. When it melted, a great flood destroyed everything. But nature returned and rebuilt itself. That is the rule of life. Everything ends, and then it starts again. Robert listened in silence. Claire also told him she had once worked as an army nurse, but now helped prevent forest fires. The seasons passed, and winter arrived. Robert struggled with nightmares and began to lose his strength. One night, he dreamed that Gladys was running through a burning forest, holding their daughter, trying to escape, but failing. In the dream, she placed the girl gently on the ground before losing her life to the flames. Robert woke up trembling. It was the first winter he truly lived through there. The snow covered everything. Beautiful, but harsh. The house and survival became harder than ever. When the snow finally melted, Robert visited Claire at the lookout tower. As they watched the sunset, she said without thinking, "It almost looks like there was never a fire here." She saw the change in Robert's expression and apologized immediately. Robert whispered, "Maybe they are gone, but I still hear them." Claire then shared her own loss, the death of her husband, and admitted she worked there so as not to drown in the pain. That same night, back at his cabin, Robert heard a noise outside. When he went out with a flashlight, he froze. A young woman lay unconscious on the ground. Robert's heart stopped. Logic said it was impossible, but his heart whispered otherwise. "My daughter, she has returned." Her leg was fractured, so he carried her carefully, cleaned her face, and set the bone in place with trembling hands. She didn't wake up. The pain could not reach her. In that state, Robert sat by her side, watching her sleep, remembering her as a baby, her laughter, her tiny hands. Finally, he too fell asleep, but when the sunlight entered the room the next morning, she was gone. The window was open. Panic invaded him. Robert ran out and searched everywhere, calling out until his voice broke, but she wasn't there. Even after a week, he walked deep into the forest every day, hoping to see her again, even just once. But the only thing he found was hope. Robert spent many days sitting by the window, waiting with hope, but nothing changed. Loneliness became heavier, almost painful. So, in his old age, he sometimes took a train to Spokane, a growing city connected by high steel railway bridges. The first time he visited, he was amazed. The world had changed so much. Tall buildings, fast cars, bright lights, everything felt new, noisy, and strange. For the first time in his life, he saw a television. On the screen, humans were traveling to space. To him, it seemed like magic. As he continued walking through the city, a man was loudly inviting everyone to see a new theatrical show. Robert bought a ticket and went in. Watching the performance, emotions overwhelmed him. His eyes filled with tears. The story on stage reminded him of his own life, his childhood, his work, his love, and all that he had lost. After the show, Robert stood in front of a mirror. He hadn't truly looked at himself in years. Now he could clearly see the wrinkles of time, the evidence of a long and difficult road. The world had moved so fast. Now, for only $4, people could fly through the sky like birds. Robert hesitated, but then thought, maybe I should try it once. He saw a strange new airplane, and with nervous hands and a racing heart, he stepped inside. As the plane rose, Robert looked out the window. From above, people looked tiny, almost like moving dots. In that moment, Robert felt a deep realization. Every person in this world has their own story, their own pain, their own memories. As he observed the world beneath him, his entire life passed silently through his mind. His youth, his work, his love for Gladys, and the memories of his daughter. Robert closed his eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time in many years, he felt peace. Time did what it always does. It moved forward. Years later, in the month of November, Robert passed away peacefully while he slept. No struggle, no fear, only silence. His small cabin remained for a time, but slowly, nature reclaimed it like everything else. Robert came into this world in silence and left just as quietly. This story reminds us of something simple yet powerful. People come and go. Some names are remembered for a short time and then slowly disappear. So don't let life become heavy. Be happy. Create memories that make your heart shine, because in the end, it is not successes or achievements that remain with us. It is the small moments of love, laughter, and connection. Life begins with the innocence of childhood, then continues through challenges, lessons, dreams, and heartbreaks. Each phase shapes us. Each fall prepares us to rise again. So here is the final message. Time moves on, life moves on, and the world moves on too. If the journey feels difficult, remember that sometimes life breaks us only to make us stronger.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.